Today is Thursday, June 9th, 2022. This presentation is a part of a larger joint project between the University of Utah School of Medicine and the American West Center. It partially fulfills an agreement with the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. More information about these buildings can be found in the Eccles Health Sciences Library on the University of Utah Health Sciences campus. Face-to-face with its third major crisis, the University of Utah Medical Center, by Keely Mruk. The title of this presentation comes from a statement issued by Dean Philip Price in 1958. The medical center had been announced by this point, but it lacked substantial public backing. Since the university only secured $4 million in support from the state legislature, public support was hugely important. So, what are the first and second crises if the building is the third? The first crisis came in 1911 when the Flexner Report, a report on the standards of medical schools in the United States, came out. This report resulted in the mass closure of schools. The University of Utah Medical School survived, but as Price notes in his statement, quote, only by a narrow margin, end quote. Many schools, which the report deemed inadequate, were forced to close. The second crisis came in 1942, when the school nearly lost its accreditation. Drastic changes to the curriculum and faculty were made, and the institution shifted to a four-year school. Now, in 1958, comes the third crisis. The university had recruited all of these great faculty members over a decade ago, and they promised that a new, large, unified facility would be constructed. As Dean Price warned in his statement, quote, if those assurances remain unhonored, we cannot expect to keep this staff at Utah, end quote. And in fact, in the previous 2 years, the University of Utah Medical School had already begun to lose faculty. So the imperative was clear. If the School of Medicine were to continue existing, let alone growing, a new medical center would have to be built. Now, as I mentioned before, the transition to a four-year program began in 1942 and really finished in 1944. The School of Medicine followed a brains, not bricks motto, where faculty appointments were prioritized over funds for new buildings. Now, recruited faculty understood this logic. However, they occasionally lamented the trade-off. Dr. Max Wintrope, photographed on the left, remarked that Salt Lake County Hospital looked like, quote, a 17th century pest house, end quote. Meanwhile, biochemical research was being carried out in converted horse stables. The earliest planning and discussion for a unified medical center dates to this post-war period, around 1946, 1947. The university awarded architecture firm Ashton, Evans, and Brazier the contract for the design and construction of the medical center, once in 1950 and again in 1956. Where do these two contracts come from? As you may recall from a previous presentation, the Cancer Research Building, shown on the right, was slated to be one wing of a larger medical complex. That larger complex will be shown on the next slide. B.E. Brazier, photographed to the left, led the construction of the Cancer Research Building. He would also be appointed the lead architect of the medical center. Now, the Cancer Research Building was completed in 1951, but as you can see in the photo, it stands alone. State budget cuts prevented the rest of the medical complex from being constructed at that time, and so the plans languished for the next several years until funds could be guaranteed. This model on the left, and you can see in the back corner, is actually the MREB, or the Cancer Research Building as it was originally known. This model shows the original design of the medical center as planned in this very early period around 1949, 1950. But as you can see, it's much different from the model on the right, which is what ultimately ends up getting built and what we have seen as the medical center on campus. So, how did these plans change? After the Board of Regents officially approved construction of a medical center for $10 million in 1956, planning for the building resumed. Remember, it had languished for a few years since about 1950. Fraser, who's photographed on the right of that photo, along with Dean Price, who's on the left, and select faculty began touring other university medical complexes. In 1957, they visited UCLA and the University of Washington in Seattle. Later that year, Fraser and other faculty toured medical centers at the universities of Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, and Syracuse. After seeing what other institutions were planning, Price and other faculty became dissatisfied with that original design that you see on the left. Martin Brixen, an architect working in the Office of Campus Planning at the time, agreed. Rather tactfully, he described this original complex as, quote, not a great building from an architectural standpoint, end quote. The School of Medicine wanted both a beautiful and a functional design, and they felt like they weren't getting it. So Martin Brixen, Dean Philip Price, and others involved in the planning of the building conspired to hold an intervention on the design. And they bring in a consultant to help break the news to Fraser. This is William Worster. Now, at the time we bring him in as a consultant, Worster was the dean of UC Berkeley's architecture school. To put it simply, he's kind of a big deal. For you design history nerds, Walter Gropius is actually cropped out of that picture on the left. His notable projects include the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford and the redevelopment of Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. He was awarded the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement in 1969. He is also known for his residential designs that you can see on the right. This home was actually designed and built for Arts and Architecture magazine. They ran a series of case study homes, each designed to solve a specific problem, and each designed to be easily and cheaply reproduced. Worster's residential designs emphasize the relationship between the built home and its surrounding landscape. Now, in 1958, he was brought into a sweaty, contentious, long design committee meeting at the University of Utah for their planning for the medical center. Remember, he's here at the request of Martin Brixen and Philip Price, and they are trying to convince Fraser on the right to redesign the medical center. I've pulled a few quotes from the meeting. It goes on for pages and pages of minutes, but so you can get a sense of the debate, that classic architectural pull between form and function, I'll read to you a sum of what those minutes say. Quote, Worster now felt that the architect should start with a preconceived form, eliminating considerations of practicality, questioning only what form should be seen against the mountains, to work backwards, as seemingly had been done with the Parthenon. That is, if the practical considerations are too dominant, beauty may suffer, end quote. It's worth noting, it's a 40-acre lot right on the foothill of the mountains that has been selected for the medical center. It's elevated over the rest of the campus, and it looks out over the city. So Worster's not wrong in wanting to emphasize those beautiful mountains and the contrast between them and the building. To continue, quote, Fraser had indicated that no medical center that he had seen or was familiar with was a good-looking project. Worster felt, therefore, that this project should be the first center in the United States that would be good-looking, end quote. And this back and forth continues for hours, but eventually Worster and the others succeed. Quote, Fraser liked the approach suggested by Worster and said he would give it a whirl. He said that he was a doubting Thomas, however, because his knowledge of the details. But he would still turn 3 or 4 teams loose on this new approach. He was glad to play with the idea, and that he would love to develop a wonderful medical center, end quote. They do manage to discuss a few other things at this meetings. They decide to use bricks as the main construction material to provide kinship with the rest of campus. They make it a priority to minimize the Western exposure to keep the building from becoming too hot and too expensive to cool. Also, they agree that dividing the building into 3 sections to reflect the 3 goals of the school, that is clinical science, basic science, and teaching. Finally, everyone agrees that flexibility for future expansion should be taken into account. Brazier actually says that he, quote, was not designing a building, but was merely starting the building, end quote. Following this meeting, Brazier actually sets up a temporary office at the medical school in order to hold regular planning meetings with faculty. For Philip Price, this was actually one of the most unique things about the medical center. When he toured a lot of the medical centers previously, he saw that it could be a contentious process and often removed from what faculty and researchers actually needed. He said that, quote, these democratic methods were a slower method, but by far the better method because it meant that the people who would ultimately use the space were the ones who helped plan it. It was not as large as many other medical centers, but it was a good deal more carefully planned, end quote. Funding support came from several different places. First, the state pledged $4 million to the medical center. Next, Leland Flint, who's photographed to the left, headed the public-facing pledge drive. Flint was a local businessman, but that kind of undersells it. In 1960, he was actually president of Zion's First National Bank. He led many fundraising campaigns for the university. Sadly, he died in 1964 before the building was completed, but not before he finished the fund drive. Ken Castleton, who became dean in 1962, solicited support from physicians throughout the city and state. Castleton actually traveled throughout southern and eastern Utah with the model, which you can see in the photograph to the right, explaining how the medical center would benefit the whole state and the whole Intermountain region, not just Salt Lake City. In the photograph to the right, you can also see Brazier with George Eccles, who was vice chairman of the fundraising campaign. This model was on display for a few weeks in Hotel Utah so the public could see it before it began traveling around the state with Ken Castleton. With funding secured and a new building design in place, construction on the medical center began in 1962. Dean Price retired that spring, and Dr. Kenneth B. Castleton took over. Castleton had a long relationship with the university. He completed his early medical studies there, taught clinical skills after returning to Utah, and as previously mentioned, solicited donations from the medical community for the medical center. While Castleton missed the planning period, construction was already underway by the time he assumed the deanship. As he described in a later interview, by the time he got there, quote, there was just a hole in the ground, end quote. Soil compaction resulted in the building sinking in these early phases of construction. Thankfully, the movement did not damage the structure. However, a firm was brought out to muckjack, and that really is the technical term, up the building. A mixture of sand, dirt, water, and other materials is piped underneath the building foundations. The force of this muck pushes the building back up to its original height. Once it sets, it ensures that the building will not continue to sink. The university advanced to the medical college funds for the completion of this work, but it did delay construction and pushed occupancy back until September or October 1964. That was their concern. Little did they know other delays in construction would result in a delayed opening until July 1965. We have a few more fun stories from the construction and design of the building. First, the photo on the right. In the background, you can see a crane, but this isn't just any crane. This is one of 3 climbing cranes that was used by the general contractors in the construction of the medical center. These climbing cranes were produced by Linden, a Danish manufacturing company. The medical center used 3, and each of them weighed over 22 tons, making them the largest climbing cranes ever built at the time. A climbing crane, unlike a normal crane, actually ascends floor by floor as the building is constructed. These cranes would also be used in the construction of the Metropolitan Hall of Justice and the University Club Tower, both constructed in 1966. Now we can pivot to the man on the left, C. Hardin Branch, the chair of the Department of Psychiatry. Earlier, I mentioned that cost and temperature were 2 key concerns of the building architects. There was not money to air condition the entire building, so planners made sure to limit the western sun exposure. They limited windows, particularly on the west and southern sides of the building. They also decided that windows would be sufficient air conditioning for rooms that had them. Interior rooms, that is rooms with no windows, would be the only rooms that actually received mechanical air conditioning. Hearing this, Branch penned a letter to the hospital administrator, writing that, quote, "To me, it is unthinkable that we would construct in a desert in this day a hospital without air conditioning for the patients. While we all admire the endurance and fortitude of our pioneer ancestors, to cling to such a standard under these circumstances is purposeless atavism." End quote. Needless to say, money was found to air condition patient rooms. In the new construction, the university continued its commitment to radiobiology research. One particularly unique feature was the counting chamber, a room installed underneath the new medical center. When working with radioactive isotopes, researchers need to be able to get accurate counts of how much radiation is in an organism, whether it's a human patient or an animal one. However, there is a natural amount of radiation in the atmosphere. This level of background radiation needs to be accounted for and ideally blocked out as much as possible to ensure an accurate count. Atmospheric nuclear testing ended in the United States in 1963. However, it continued throughout the world. Further complicating matters, the Bessemer process used in steel refining actually incorporates elements from the atmosphere. Radioactive elements had been circulating in the atmosphere and therefore all subsequently produced steel since the Trinity test in 1945. So, if all steel has trace amounts of radiation in it, what can you use to construct a counting chamber? The solution is actually to use old steel. And now we can understand why there's a battleship on the screen. This is the USS Indiana, and it's constructed in 1939. It's launched in 1941, and it served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. This South Dakota-class battleship was present at Guadalcanal, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and Iwo Jima, among other battles. The Indiana was decommissioned in 1947 and sat in reserve. In 1963, the Navy elected to sell the Indiana for scrap. 210 tons from the hull of the USS Indiana were shipped to Salt Lake for use as the underground counting chamber at the University of Utah's new medical center. The Indiana, constructed in 1939, had minimally radioactive steel in its hull. In the photo on the left, you can see cranes trying to move these massive slabs of steel near the University Medical Center. Our counting chamber was disassembled in 1988 and shipped to Richland, Washington, where it is currently still in use as a counting chamber by the Department of Energy to monitor plutonium workers there. The new medical center opened in 1965. Here on the left, we see Florence Strong cutting the ribbon. Florence Strong worked in the dean's office for 25 years before retiring in 1964. Students described her as a constant, quote, friend, advisor, confidant, and student advocate, end quote. They often joked about naming the new facility the Florence Strong Memorial Hospital. While the hospital does not bear her name, she did get the honor of cutting the ribbon at the opening. Students also had their own thoughts about the new building, and they should. Many students, both in the College of Medicine and the College of Nursing, actually pledged contributions to the building while they were enrolled. In the 1967 yearbook, students wrote that, quote, "The brief exposure we had to the old county hospital engendered no nostalgia for its leaking ceilings, the panhandlers, and the Spartan accommodations. The new building is nearly everything we had hoped for, but it seems incredible that a building situated with such a panoramic view of the valley should have so few windows opening onto it, and those that do are often covered with prosaic concrete lattice," end quote. Clearly, students are not as preoccupied with the issue of sun control as the planners were. These next few images also come from a yearbook, but the 1969 yearbook. These students, those lucky ducks, never had to work in the old county hospital, so they really don't know how good they have it. But I guess that means they're able to poke a little bit more fun at it. The building is compared to a body throughout the yearbook. Note in particular the blurry picture of the elevator, quote, "the sluggish cardiovascular system," and the concrete lattice, or should I say the, quote, "beautiful integument with lovely student parking facilities." As always, parking was a major source of student griping. We are about to flip through a number of letters that can be summarized as, "Dear Ken, I need space." And if you don't mind, I'm going to jump through them and then pause on one slide in particular. What I mostly want to do is illustrate the quantity of these letters. Shortly after the building was built, we already began running low on space. When the College of Nursing opened in 1965, not even 3 full years after the medical center had been open, Castleton began asking who would want to move into the suite on the first floor of the medical center, and he had no shortage of responses. Lou Goodman, chair of the Department of Pharmacology, specifies that this is the 3rd letter that he has actually written Dean Castleton on the issue of space. Clearly, he's been asking about this long before space from the College of Nursing was made available. Dean Castleton claims that originally, quote, "we had room to spare. We really did. We were rattling around in that building, no question about it," end quote. But there is a literal folder, which you can see photographed here, or wait, actually, there are literal boxes that show otherwise. Ken Castleton and I are hopefully the only 2 people that have had to read through all of these, though I'm sure today's administration sympathizes with the endless requests of faculty for space. Price, though retired, was asked about this too, and he took a more measured view, saying that, quote, "by the time the building was actually occupied, the school had grown. Its needs had grown. So you had a period of 8 or 10 years of growth that by the time the center was occupied represented unmet needs. So no wonder the center seemed to be too small when they moved into it." Within another 10 years, plans were in place to expand the medical center. In 1975, the Utah State Legislature approved a $50 million appropriation to expand the existing medical center. An accompanying fundraising campaign added an additional $10 million. As a point of comparison, the original medical center cost $16 million, and this was already $6 million over its proposed budget. In the photo on the left from the groundbreaking for the 1977 expansion, we see from left to right, Utah Governor Scott Matheson, University of Utah President David Gardner, University of Utah Vice President for Health Sciences John Dixon, and George S. Eccles, who chaired fundraising for the expansion. While the expansion originally called for extensive renovation to the existing medical center, a study of the building's earthquake safety revealed that it would likely not meet the state's current uniform building code for hospitals. The more aesthetic plan that had originally been drafted was then scrapped in favor of reinforcing the existing medical center building and making sure that the expanded hospital would satisfy the new requirements for building codes. The medical center, like the Medical Research and Education Building, or the Cancer Research Building to use its older name, ultimately escaped undergoing major renovations. Instead, small fixes were often deployed as needed, and funding new constructions on the health sciences campus remained the top priority going forward. To conclude, we'll return to Philip Price's statement on the medical center. Here we see him at the cornerstone laying ceremony of the medical center in 1962. This is a long quote, but it's meant to reassure all planners of the medical center, all planners of the medical school, or really the health sciences part of campus in general, all planners now and into the future. You are not alone. This is not the first time that all of the problems have happened. Here's what Price has to say. Quote, "It is noteworthy that the most vocal opponents of the proposed medical center here are those who have vested interest, those who are myopic, those who are naturally conservative and allergic to any change or growth, and those who have come out most strong in support of the proposal are persons characterized by courage, by faith in the future, those who would like to be builders for the next generation. I, for one, would rather go down in temporary defeat fighting for an ideal that has promise for the future rather than take an easier, do-nothing course. It is no exaggeration to say that Utah has rarely had such an opportunity by a single bold step to accomplish so much for itself and for the West, both now and in decades ahead." Thank you for your attention during this presentation. I encourage you to explore the Health Sciences Library on the Health Sciences campus if you have more questions about the history of that campus and people who inhabited it.